They called him Al-Muharrik, the Instigator. After the Ramadan Offensive left dozens of American soldiers dead, the CIA gave me one mission: find him and eliminate him. But what I discovered in the shadows of post-invasion Iraq would haunt my Senate testimony for years. The committee room in D.C. was cold the day I spoke, though my palms still carried the heat of that winter in Baghdad. The senators wanted facts, but I could only give them memories stitched together from the smell of cordite, the drone of generators, and the silence that followed a helicopter going down. I had been briefed in sterile offices, but nothing could prepare you for the sound of a Chinook being torn apart midair. The crew I had spoken to 3 days earlier, men who joked about the instant coffee and the sand in their teeth, were now reduced to blackened metal and desert dust. That was the opening shot of the offensive for me. And from that point forward, every order, every movement, every hour of surveillance felt personal. Baghdad in December 2003 was a place where shadows had weight. The streetlights were unreliable, half the city in blackout, the other half glowing under the dim yellow pools where the bulbs still worked. The air smelled of burning trash and hot diesel, layered over the metallic tang of dry blood that seemed baked into the concrete. Convoys were no longer met with wary stares. They were met with eyes that measured distance and timing, calculating whether a suicide car could reach you before your gunners could react. The Ramadan Offensive had turned the capital into a chessboard of kill zones. And into that, I was inserted, not as a soldier, not as a diplomat, but as something in between. The orders had been clear enough on paper. Locate Al-Muharrik, dismantle his network, deny the insurgency its unifying leader. But even the first briefings, I could feel the edges fraying. No photograph existed. No confirmed name. He was a shadow passed from safe house to safe house, a voice on grainy cassette tapes, a name scrawled in graffiti on the walls of Sadr City. His messages weren't orders in the conventional sense. They were parables, instructions wrapped in story, guiding fighters to attack convoys here, plant IEDs there. And yet, every strike attributed to him landed like a hammer blow on our operational tempo. Colonel Abbas was my first lifeline into the maze. A former Ba'athist intelligence officer, he was the kind of man who could blend into the crowd in Fallujah or sit across from you in a fortified green zone meeting room without changing expression. He knew who was moving weapons through Ramadi, which safe houses were used by former Mukhabarat officers, which clerics were preaching subtle calls to arms in Friday sermons. But Abbas had survived the regime's fall by becoming useful to whoever held power. I trusted him as far as the cash in his pocket, and even then I double-counted. His first piece of actionable intel came in the form of a hand-drawn map, the paper smudged and worn, marking a cluster of houses on the outskirts of Fallujah. He claimed one of these served as a relay point for messages between Al-Muharrik's emissaries and local cell leaders. We moved on it slowly, using the methods that wouldn't draw attention. No armored convoys, no obvious overwatch teams. Just 2 men, me and an Iraqi asset named Kareem, blending into the night traffic on Route 10 in a beat-up Opel sedan. Kareem kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel, while I scanned the sidewalks through the window's dirty glass. The target house was one of many squat concrete buildings, each crowned with satellite dishes and laundry lines. Our cover was simple: 2 cousins visiting family in town. Our surveillance was less simple: a micro camera disguised in my shoulder bag, recording every vehicle that stopped at the address, every man who stepped inside. Nights in Fallujah had their own soundtrack. The constant thrum of diesel generators filled the air, overlaid by bursts of distant gunfire and the occasional thud of an explosion. Dogs barked without pause, their senses tuned to threats we couldn't see. In the shadows, figures moved quickly and with purpose, the way people do when they know staying outside too long invites questions, or worse. We stayed until nearly 3 in the morning, logging patterns, marking the arrival of a man who came in a battered white Toyota, stayed inside for 45 minutes, and left with his head down. His gait, his build, the way the others deferred to him. Kareem thought he might be one of the couriers Abbas had described. Back in Baghdad, our safe house was a rented apartment in Qarada, chosen for its view of two major intersections and the ease with which we could disappear into traffic if compromised. The walls were bare concrete, the furniture mismatched, the power unreliable. We had a radio set tuned to secure channels, a satellite uplink the size of a small suitcase, and a weapons rack that was never more than an arm's reach away. Nights were spent reviewing footage, cross-referencing vehicle plates with human from other sources, and piecing together the spiderweb of connections. The paranoia was constant. Informants had a habit of vanishing, sometimes because they'd been compromised, sometimes because they played both sides once too often. A tale could be a legitimate threat, or just another driver heading home. You never knew until it was too late. I started sleeping in 2-hour bursts, boots on, rifle within reach. The line between hunter and hunted blurred in the low light of our safe house, and every shadow on the street below felt heavier than the night before. When a boss next came through the door, he brought not just information, but a scent of desperation. He claimed the command cell we were chasing had shifted north, somewhere along the approaches to Tikrit. He didn't know exactly where, but he knew the name of a man, Hassan al-Masri, who was supposedly the bridge between Al-Muharrik's propaganda arm and his operational planners. If we could find Hassan, we could trace the chain upward. It wasn't much, but in this war, even the faintest lead was worth the risk. And as I prepared to move north, I couldn't shake the feeling that every mile we drove was taking me closer not just to Al-Muharrik, but to the point of no return. Moving north from Baghdad was never simple in those days. The highways were a living map of threats. Zones we knew were mined, overpasses favored by RPG teams, stretches where burned-out cars marked the sites of earlier ambushes. Kareem drove as I scanned the road ahead, my rifle muzzle angled toward the floorboard but ready. We used a convoy of exactly 2 vehicles. Never one, never 3. 1 was too easy to trap. 3 was too much like a military column. Our Opel led, a battered Hyundai trailing half a kilometer back with 2 other assets. No comms chatter unless it was urgent, and when it came, it was in short bursts of coded phrases that meant nothing to anyone outside the loop. Tikrit sat on the Tigris like a coiled animal, the birthplace of Saddam and a city that still clung to its loyalty to him. Intelligence analysts back at the Green Zone liked to mark it as high hostility, but that label never told the real story. Here, the hostility was quiet, faces that lingered on you too long, shopkeepers who stopped mid-sentence when you passed, kids who didn't wave at foreigners the way they sometimes did elsewhere. The city didn't need open threats. Its silence was a threat of its own. But the hunt wasn't just about finding Hassan. It was about eroding the myth he served. In the Green Zone, the analysts had been studying Al-Muharrik's messaging, tracing it from mosque sermons to low-tech cassette tapes that circulated in the markets, to graffiti slogans sprayed on walls in the dead of night. We tried to disrupt that flow, paying street kids to paint over the slogans before sunrise, flooding certain markets with counterfeit tapes that carried subtly altered messages. In psychological warfare, you didn't need to destroy the myth outright. You just needed to introduce enough doubt that it weakened on its own. Still, the myth had deep roots. Every week, somewhere in Iraq, a new video surfaced claiming responsibility for an attack under the direction of Al-Muharrik. The voice was always different, but the tone was the same, calm, assured, promising that the Americans would bleed until they left. The more I studied these recordings, the more I understood this wasn't a single man's voice. It was a script, a brand, and it could be worn like a mask by anyone with the will to step into the role. We finally caught a break when a courier we'd been watching for days switched vehicles and took the highway toward Samarra. We followed at a distance, trading the lead between our car and the Hyundai, using gaps in traffic to avoid being made. He led us to a farm compound outside the city, a walled perimeter, 2 guard posts, and a main building with its windows blacked out. Satellite imagery later confirmed the presence of a small radio tower on the property. From there, the tempo of the hunt increased. We mapped the farm's routines, when guards rotated, which nights trucks arrived, how long they stayed. Our comms with the Green Zone became more frequent, feeding them intel packets through the satellite link for targeting assessments. Every move felt like tightening the net, but the closer we got, the more uneasy I became. Abbas was less steady than before. His meetings with us grew shorter, his explanations more vague. I began to suspect he was passing some of our movements back to other players, maybe even to the very network we were trying to dismantle. In Baghdad, we'd say an informant like that was burning both ends of the candle, profiting from selling us information while also keeping his standing with the insurgents. It was a dangerous game, and if he was caught, they'd make an example out of him. If we were caught relying on him, the same might happen to us. Yet without him, our map of the insurgent network was incomplete. I couldn't walk away, not yet. Every night, as I lay on my cot in the safe house, I'd think of the Chinook. The noise before the impact, the silence after. I told myself the hunt was about stopping that from happening again. But in the small hours, I wondered if it was about revenge, and whether revenge would blind me to the truth when I finally stood face to face with the instigator. The deeper we pushed into the network, the more it became clear that Al-Muharrik was not a man who could be cornered and captured. He was a silhouette, a signature without a face, a brand applied to every major attack in central Iraq, whether or not he, or anyone, had truly ordered it. The myth worked like a flag planted on shifting ground. Groups that hated each other in the 1990s were now coordinating raids, sharing safehouses, pooling weapons caches, because they all claimed they fought under the same invisible commander. Our analysts traced the first confirmed mention of the name to a leaflet dropped in Fallujah months before the invasion, urging citizens to resist the coming crusaders. It wasn't signed, but after the invasion, the leaflet started carrying a small emblem, a burning palm tree, and a pseudonym, Al-Muharrik. The insurgents understood that a war without a symbol was just random violence. With the instigator's name stamped on it, every act became part of a story. In Tikrit, we saw the machinery of that story. Hassan al-Masri wasn't a field commander. He was a messenger, a middleman who collected reports from cell leaders, reshaped them, and redistributed them with Al-Muharrik's signature. He moved between neighborhoods quietly, delivering cassette tapes, printed leaflets, and even coded phrases to be inserted into sermons. In the courtyard of one mosque, I saw a mural being painted, masked fighters, an American Humvee in flames, and in the corner, the burning palm tree emblem. The painter worked quickly, glancing over his shoulder at passing traffic, while children gathered to watch. The myth was being seeded in the next generation before our eyes. I kept the discovery to myself for several days, unwilling to share it with Abbas until I understood the implications. If Al-Muharrik could be anyone, if the voice could change from week to week, the hand from month to month, then killing the man in the safe house wouldn't end the war. It might even make the myth stronger. A dead leader is a martyr. A leader revealed as a fabrication is something else entirely. Abbas noticed my hesitation. His questions grew more pointed. Why weren't we moving on the farm compound yet? Why were we still watching, recording, mapping? His impatience was a danger in itself. I had begun to suspect that he knew more than he was saying, maybe even who had worn the mask of Al-Muharrik in the past. The Green Zone was impatient too. Command wanted results, names on a kill list, not sociological analysis. The Ramadan Offensive had shaken them, and they needed to show progress. When I sent in my report about the network being a rotating cast of voices rather than a single leader, the response was short. Target remains high priority. Proceed with disruption plan. They didn't care if the man in the safe house was the original or the 10th. They wanted a headline and a body to match it. The longer we stayed in Tikrit, the heavier the air felt. We rotated safe houses every 48 hours to avoid patterns. We switched vehicles so often I sometimes forgot which one we were in until I looked down at the cracked dashboard or smelled the upholstery. The farm compound remained under surveillance, its guard shifts, its deliveries, but each night I stared at the photos and felt the same weight. We were hunting a ghost. One evening, while reviewing footage from a concealed camera near the compound, I saw Hassan himself arriving in a white pickup, greeted at the gate by 2 armed men. He wasn't cautious. He wasn't even in disguise. That told me 2 things. He felt untouchable, and he knew someone inside our world was keeping him informed about our movements. The worst confirmation came a week later. Kareem spotted the same man who had been loitering across from our surveillance position in the early days, this time parked 2 streets over from our current safe house. He wasn't there for long, just long enough to look at the building, make a call, and drive away. It was too clean to be coincidence. I didn't tell a boss we'd been spotted. I wanted to see what he would do next. The following night, he failed to show for a scheduled meet. No word, no excuse. In this line of work, silence was an answer in itself. It was then that I understood the real danger. If Al-Muharrik was an idea, then the people sustaining it were infinitely replaceable. But the conduits, the men like Abbas and Hassan who kept the current flowing, were finite. The operation was no longer about one face. It was about cutting the cables that carried the myth from one mind to another. That clarity didn't make the job easier. It made the decision heavier. Because now, as the raid window approached, I wasn't sure if I was going in to end something or to prove that it could never be ended at all. We launched at 0200 hours. The desert north of Tikrit was cold enough that the breath inside my NVG lenses fogged when I exhaled too hard. The safe house sat in the middle of an open stretch of farmland, surrounded by a low wall of sun-baked brick and a gate reinforced with corrugated steel. From above, the compound was just a dark square in the pale dust, but I knew the layout by heart. 4 rooms along the west wall, 2 guard shacks by the gate, a central courtyard with a single rusted water tank. The staging point was a kilometer out. 2 Black Hawks dropped us in low, their rotors fading into the night before the sound could travel. Delta handled the breach team. I was embedded for identification and evidence recovery. We moved in staggered lines, rifles high, boots whispering against the sand. No radios now, just hand signals, gloved fingers slicing through the green haze of NVGs. At the wall, the breach team set the charges. I felt my heartbeat in my fingertips, each second stretching thin as wire. The cold bit into my knuckles, but sweat still trickled down my spine. Then, flash, concussion, the wall folded in on itself in a puff of brick dust, and we were inside. The first guard died before he could raise his weapon. The second ran toward the main building, shouting something I couldn't make out over the sound of boots hitting the ground. We fanned out. 2 operators left toward the courtyard, 3 sweeping the rooms along the wall. I moved with the point man toward the far door. Inside, the air was thick with stale tobacco and unwashed bodies. A bare bulb swayed from the ceiling, its yellow light cutting through the NVG green. Papers littered the floor, maps, handwritten notes, what looked like target photographs. I swept them into my pack, even as shouts echoed from deeper in the building. We found Hassan in the last room, crouched over a metal case, a satellite phone still in his hand. His eyes widened, but he didn't freeze. He moved, trying to slam the case shut. I kicked it out of his reach, the metal snapping against the wall, and in that moment I saw him clearly. Not the face from any wanted poster. There were none. But the posture, the quiet certainty. This was a man who believed the myth because he had helped make it real. And then I saw another man in the corner, hands bound, hood over his head. An older figure, shoulders slumped, dressed in civilian clothes. A boss. The world narrowed to a tunnel. Hassan was shouting in Arabic, 2 operators holding him down, the hood on Abbas twitching as he coughed. My mind raced. If Abbas had been taken here, he'd been compromised for days. Maybe he'd let us here on someone else's orders. Or maybe he'd been used as bait. Then the choice came, fast, brutal, final. Hassan was one conduit of the myth, maybe the strongest we'd found. Taking him alive meant exposing the machinery behind Al-Muharrik. But that also meant weeks of holding him in a system that might trade him away in a political deal. Killing him here meant no rescue, no resurgence. But the myth could adapt, could put another voice in the mask by morning. I looked at him, sweat on his brow, calm in his eyes, and realized that whatever I did, the war would go on. The operators waited, weapons ready, the moment balanced on a breath. I gave the signal, not to shoot, to bind him. He'd live for now. The truth needed a voice, even if it came from the enemy's mouth. The exfil was chaos, gunfire cracking from the outer wall, a truck engine roaring to life somewhere in the dark. We pushed through the breach as the compound burned, the cold air shredding the smell of smoke into the night. The Black Hawks came in low, rotors chopping the darkness, and we were gone before the horizon began to pale. We held Hassan for 43 days. In that time, I heard more about the making of Al-Muharrik than I had in all the months before. There was no founder, no original voice. The name had been passed like a torch through hands in Mosul, Ramadi, Fallujah, each bearer adding their own cadence, their own threats, their own lies. The symbol was the unifier. The man was irrelevant. Abbas survived, but he was done. Whatever lines he'd tried to walk, they'd collapsed under him. He was extracted to Amman under a different name, a ghost in a different war. I never saw him again. 2 months later, Hassan was gone. The official report called it a transfer, but I knew better. Somewhere, in some dimly lit room, another voice was already rehearsing the lines. And so years later, when I sat before the Senate committee in that cold chamber, the chairman asked if the mission had been a success. I told him the truth as I understood it. We had dismantled one network, but the myth still breathed. We had taken a mask from one face, but another had already put it on. The senators scribbled notes. The record will say I answered clearly, concisely, without hesitation. But in my mind, I was still in Tikrit in that swaying bulb room, looking at a man who knew exactly what he was, and at another who had traded his own truth away to survive. I could still feel the cold night air as the rotors lifted us from the desert, and the knowledge that the war we were fighting was not just in the streets, but in the stories we could not kill. Thanks for watching. If the story meant something to you, consider subscribing. We've got more like this, stories that don't ask for sympathy, just honesty.